So we're going to go through, like I just mentioned, kind of some of the administration features, groups and how to set up users and how to set some of the retention policies behind some of the data we're keeping. There's a number of things that we pre-configure for you when we install the application that you really will never need to change and probably shouldn't try to change. But if you're really on the technical side, and you do need to point to it, if you change the server and try to move that yourself, then with our applications, and these are the kind of things that you can look at how we store that information. So now once I've logged in, and I've logged in as admin, which I think most of you know. Let me pull that off. How that works, and you got your user set up, and we'll go through how to set up a user. There's also up in the right-hand corner, you see this little green icon. That's to set your home page for where you want. Whenever you click home on any of the applications, that'll go back as the home page. So if I go to LS reporting, I want this to be my home page. If I set this, that green icon will go away, which tells you that is now the home page for your login, your default. That's actually stored in memory. If you clear your cache out and stuff, you'll have to reset that page. But as long as you don't clear the browser cache, you'll be able to it'll retain that parameter for your home page. So when I go into any application, I just go to Analytics now, and I click. Well, that's actually a bad one. Let me go to LS Reporting, and I'll go. You go here. Anytime I go home, you see the green home button. It's always going to go back to this page, right? Historically, it's always gone back to our first sheet here, but now it'll actually go to whatever you mark as a home page. Actually, we didn't really talk about it. This is a new feature many of you probably have. Some of the older versions don't. And three of the graphs are the collection of the activity monitor, or the listener data that you have on your application, where we collect. Dave will be covering that tomorrow, but that collects for all transactions within Lawson or MS add-ins. We get the user, the transaction that went into, the form they went into, the date and the time they used that form, how they used that form, function code, and what the key to the record was. So you would know that Dan Kinsey went into AP10.1 and did a change on vendor number 1000. So we keep all that data for you, and there's a lot of things we do with that information. But some of these graphs then tell you the number of transactions you have by application, which percentage, what applications are eating up the most resources. You can change some of these date parameters for, I want to look at how much activity I have over a certain time frame and what days is most active and what times of days is most active. And then down at the bottom, you have the segregation of duty, really dashboard for where your violations are in your policies. And Dave will go into that a little bit more. But there are potentially 6 colors that can show up on these graphs. And what you're going to focus on are maybe your policies that violate a 4 or 5 star policy. So we have ratings on every policy. We start them all at 3. You can rate them 1 through 5, 5 being generally your most critical. And then the black would indicate that it's a disabled policy because we deliver about 240. And the gray would indicate that it passes. So I can see on something like cash management of the policies that I have enabled, and if I hover over this, I have 3 policies enabled and I don't have any violations. But if I come to closing, I have, on 3-star violations, I have 4. I'm going to have 4 violations. 33% of my policies are being violated, right? And I have a couple then that are not active. But this blue color is the one that's going to tell you where you actually have a 5-star policy being violated. So this just gets updated every night, or you can run it on demand. I'll show you how to do some of those run on demand updates. So you can update this graph, and it's the same. When Dave gets over to the SOD dashboard, it'll be the same graphs. Let me go into the admin panel here, and there's a couple things I'm going to skip over, but for the most part, I really want to kind of cover the configuration. You can look at some statistics on the overview, and you can look, what's running, and you can see how much data you're collecting in the system, how many transactions have flowed through, that kind of thing. You can kind of see that on this page, right? But I'm not going to go too much into this, but this is keeping real-time data, and it gives us some information when we need some feedback on your system. What I really want to focus on is the configuration section. So I'll go through some of these in detail. And this is pretty well documented, and in our manual, I basically go through every field is in the admin guide that we're going to show you on here today. There's a couple that we don't want you to change, so I might have documentation on it, but for the most part, every field is documented in here. So we'll just start with basic server configuration. And there's a couple things here that we've documented that you may want to go, and that goes into the system debug. Again, most of this other, the SBus homepage, you can see the SBus user administrator is entered in here. Some of these other parameters we really don't want you to change. We'll set those up for you. Here's the SBus password, so if you go into the SBus administrator, you can change that password through here for admin. Now, if I come down to, I can also turn on system debug and a debugging level, and this will keep a log. If we start to have problems in the application, we can turn debugging on. So Mike may call you and ask you to turn debug on. We'll collect some data, and then we can tell what's going on. But there's not much there. It's kept within Tomcat. It's a debugging log within Tomcat that we will then track to see maybe what's going on with the server if we're having a problem. But that's really all you want to change and what you want to do within the basic server configuration. I would just probably the system debugging level. On the global configuration, this is just for when we automatically send out reports. So when we get to scheduling and we do the automatic notifications of either a SOD reports, security audit reports, or transaction auditing reports can be sent out through email notifications. And we keep a log of all the sent reports. And all this is asking you is how long do you want to keep that log of sent reports? So you can retain them forever, you can delete them after 7 days, but it's just a way for you to visually go in and make sure that these reports are being sent. Right? So a pretty simple parameter there. Transaction auditing, there's some things you can do here, and Dave might cover this a little bit more, or we can cover this again tomorrow a little bit, but there's some things on whether or not we even have auditing enabled and if we have listener enabled. So you can turn the auditing and listening at least the collection data on and off. Now the application within WebSphere is still running, but we won't be collecting anything in the database. I don't have a good reason for you to turn that off, but it's something we can turn on and off in case maybe the Kinsey server is getting too full and you want to stop collecting data. You can turn that off until you expand that. Even though WebSphere will try to send the data and we'll get it on our site, we just won't retain any of that data. And then here's how long you can retain for the listener activity. So the activity monitor or listener, same product, that's just that summarized data of what I just talked about before, the user, the form, the date, and the time. There's no parameters that you have to configure behind that for what you want to keep. We keep everything that people within the Lawson S3 application. So all your HR payroll, procurement suite, all the supply chain, finance, that's all kept. So we keep everything. So you don't have to tell it what forms you want to keep or what users you want to retain this for. We retain everything, but you might want to delete it after a certain number of days. So you can keep it. You'll see here some preset parameters are retained forever. Right? And then in the background, a script will run will clear that out when it hits that many days old. Right? We're actually not using this parameter, but when I come over here on the store, and that's noted in the documentation. When I get over on this right side, this is where I can set. Do I want to collect DME data, which would be calls from like MS add-ins? So if you want to collect all the inquiries from the add-ins that come through, we can collect that DME data. A lot of people don't, some people do. Kind of the same with IDA. And then there's some options here on skipping certain URLs that you don't want us to audit those transactions on. And then this is kind of a big one here. There's use transaction security. When you get to if you have transaction auditing, this only applies to that application, and a handful of you do. What we will do is we can either set in transaction auditing the forms that you don't want people to have access to when they're looking at reports. So if you have a certain person set up that can run reports, but you don't want them to look at any data that has anything to do with HR 11, you can specify that in our security model within our application. You can also put fields that you don't want to be displayed. So maybe you never want a social security number or something to be displayed when you're building any queries. So you can use our security that we got built in for that, or because one reason people might want to is because you might give access to this tool to a person that isn't set up to have Lawson access. So they want to be able to run reports, but they're not a Lawson user. So you can't use the LDAP security because they're not in Lawson, and they would never be able to generate a report. So we can use our own security if that's how you want to define it. Or if you turn that use transaction security off, it'll actually use LDAP security. And now it'll look to say the user that is logged in and generating, they have to have the same user login IDs, we have to match them up. But the user that's logged in here to our application, we'll check LDAP to see if they have access to that form. And if they don't have access to that form through Lawson, they can't generate any reports on it through our application. So if they're not an HR user, they can't go out and all of a sudden start building queries to look at HR data, right? We'll actually look at LDAP to determine whether or not they have that access. So you have two ways of building that. But again, we had to do that because we have people using the tool that aren't necessarily Lawson users and they're not set up in a profile for Lawson. Okay, so that kind of covers that global configuration. So you kind of want to look at this parameter, how long you want to retain. The two that probably get changed the most after we set them up are how long do you want to retain this data and what kind of security do you want to use if you have transaction on it. Now, Dave may touch on this, but I'll just show it here real quick. Segregation of duties config. When we do our reporting, like Dave will show you, we don't consider a form to be in violation if it's only got inquiry access. So if it's got plus, minus, IN, or P, that's an inquiry-only access, and we don't consider that a violation. They have to have some kind of change capability for us to be concerned about the form. We'll go ahead and give people inquiry to the vendor file, and let's say they can enter invoices, as long as they can't enter vendors and enter invoices. But if you're inquiry only, we don't care. So what these function codes are what do you want us to check as what type of access a user might have on a form. So we check for ACD, and we check for Q for like quick entry or quick post, I think, for GL. So you can add to these if you want to check for more function codes, but if we find the user has one of these function code access on a form, that's what we consider violation. Everything else is okay. And you can control these, but it defaults with this. Roles to skip. If you don't have LAUA, probably most of you don't, this doesn't apply anymore. But for LS, we'll have people that will have administration rules that are probably going to violate almost every one of our policies because they're going to have some kind of open access. So if you want us to skip specific roles so they don't keep showing up on your reports, you can specify those roles in here, and they won't show up in your LS or your SOD reports. They'll show up in your LS reports, not your SOD reports. So you don't have to continue to look at roles that you know are in violation that are attached to users. Otherwise, that user is just going to show up all the time, and it's pointless. Right? Then this use database for LS, SOD, and not LDAP. Generally, for our customers that have a larger model for security, we will take the data that we pull into our tables on the Kinsey virtual server you have set up, and we'll run the SOD checks against our database and not against LDAP directly. We do that really for performance reasons, if nothing else, because we don't want to hit LDAP hard during the day, just like our reporting, we pull the data over. So that same database we use for the reporting, we'll actually check against your SOD policies. So if during the day you find a violation and then you fix your security and you run it, you still have a violation, more than likely it's because we're checking the data that's in our tables. You would need to recollect that data, as I'll show you here on some of our tools. So if you want to see those changes reflected in your reports or SOD during the day, you got to go grab that data again and populate our tables. Or you can actually check this. That would actually be, this would be used, I want to use our database, it should be checked. I'm actually checking against LDAP directly. But for smaller models, people want to just check right against LDAP. So we have customers that, that have maybe, a couple hundred employees versus thousands of employees. The model's much smaller. So what they'll do is they'll actually, they'll have this unchecked. Right now I had it unchecked. So I'm looking at LDAP directly when I run my SOD policies, and I'm not looking at our tables. So now when you make a change in Lawson Security and apply it, I can run a report and it'll be reflected immediately. But that's what this will do. So this is saying, do you want to run against the LS or do you want to run against LDAP? And I'll leave it the way it was so I don't mess up Dave's demo. But that's what those are for. I'm going to skip over the temp file. That's just where we keep some of our temp files. No reason for you to change this. We generally will ask you where you want those when we do a configuration, when we do an install. I'm going to go down to, we don't need any of the LAUA stuff. The Lawson product, this is actually covered in a different, I'm not going to cover too much of this today. There are a couple of things here. There's a lot of things here we just don't want you to change. But there are a couple of things you can do here. Security model over here on the right. If you only run LS and not LAUA, it'll take some of the LAUA options off some of our applications because our products run against both models. So, for instance, in SOD, if you don't run LAUA at all anymore, then you can turn that option off, and some of those options for LAUA will come off the screens. So this is one you can control a little bit here. The other one you might want to put here is this looking at this, it seems like we have this there. We had this. Oh, no, that was transaction auditing. So on this listener retention, this data you want to pull. You can also set the retention of this data up here on the production server for how long you want this data retained. I'm going to have to actually be honest with you. I'm going to have to ask Mike why we have that. Oh, these are. I'm sorry, this is my mistake. This is the statistical retention versus the actual data itself. So we keep these stats on. You saw like the percentage. We saw all the pie charts on the analytics screen. That's the retention of this data is up here on this transaction auditing global. How long do we want to keep this data on the statistical side, right? But the actual data itself is configured down here on how long do I want to keep the actual listener transactions out there versus the stats. So you can reset those stats every 14 days or something if you want, but that will not purge the data. This parameter will actually purge the data. And there's not much really on here other than this checkbox and probably what you're going to have over here that you're going to need to worry about on the configuration side. Other than that, there is one thing you can do here. Is we saw the reporting yesterday. So you saw all the columns that were on the grid that defaulted on. You can control those defaults down here. So these are all the fields of data that we keep on various reports throughout the system. So you'll see like forms, form description. So this is a hidden column. So if you always want to hide, maybe you don't want the IP address on some of the transaction auditing reports, or you don't want the role description to show up by default, right? You can see you're going to see those down here. So this is going to always hide the role description. You can unhide it when you go to generate that report, but on the reporting yesterday there was a columns button that was at the top of the screen that allowed you to display the columns, and you can select which ones you want to hide and show. You can set those defaults here so that every time you go into that report, if you never need, inheritance, then you can always hide the inheritance field, and you don't have to worry about it showing up. But you can control that through this LS configuration production servers. There's also the same configuration for the test server, and you can control what fields you want showing up on those queries, right, by default. It's just what the data is there. It's just the columns will be hidden. We won't get into the landmark. Some of this stuff I don't think we really need to worry about. But those are the basic parameters under the configuration section that you're going to want to maybe take a look at and may need to change. So I'm going to let me jump. This is the same as what the dashboard would look like. So let me jump down to, and I'll come back to the schedule. Let me jump to user administration. This has been expanded substantially since we probably maybe put your application in. So if you haven't gone into haven't updated the last 8 months, then you probably don't have a screen that looks like this. So what we can do here is control by the user. So to set up a user, it's just add new user up here. Put in a username, password. The email address right now is not being used for anything, but future we may use that. Put your name and password in, and we'll set up a user. Now we'll check these. It's going to be checked by default, but I'm just going to go to the admin user here. So first off, I can control what do I want to have people to get access to. So you see level 1 is, do I even want them in the admin panel? Do I want them in transaction audit, right? And you can control which options from our dashboard people can even get into. There are subsets then under each one of those. So if I can get into the administration, SBUS admin, which is where I am now, which one of the options down this left-hand side can a user actually have access to? So maybe you'll allow somebody that runs SOD reports to get into the SOD rules, but nothing else, right? You're not going to allow them to use administration. You're not going to allow, maybe they can do audit rules too, and maybe they can run some scheduled tasks, but you can keep them out of everything else. So all these configuration options I just showed you on the configuration sheet, you can just uncheck this, and those users would not be able to get into that option. Same thing here for, so I get to transaction auditing. So if they have access to transaction auditing, it's whether or not they can export the reports to Excel. So we have customers that have these auditing tools, but they don't want just data being exported out and somebody can just save it in Excel. So you can restrict who can actually export transactions and who is allowed to do it. On the report restrictions, this is where we have that use TA security versus using LDAP security. So if I'm using the auditing security, I can come in here and restrict for this user what forms that they can generate reports for. So if I don't want them in any HR forms, I can just put in HR asterisk, and they won't be able to get into HR forms. Actually, because that's the system code, I can just put in HR and semicolon, and I can put in maybe benefits. So they won't be able to run any forms in the HR system code or the benefit system code. If I wanted, HR, all the HR 11s, I can do it this way, or I can specify .1, .2. But then they won't be able to generate any reports for data for that set of forms, HR 11, .1, .2, .3. And so you can put restrictions on here. So this is where, again, if I'm giving people access to this tool that don't have access to Lawson, and I want to restrict what they can get into, I can take away certain forms or system codes from them viewing any of that data. You can do the same thing down here on field restrictions. So maybe you give them access to all the forms, but you don't want them to see specific fields. So I'm not going to give anybody access, or I'm not going to show even the employee Social Security number on any of the audit reports. We're just going to, that field will not even show up. So if it's an external auditor that wants to see reports, but you don't want to, there's some information you don't want anybody to see, that information doesn't hide it or mask it, it just doesn't show the field at all on the report. And so it's just filtered out. So you can set that into here, or again, you could use the LDAP security, and we'll use that instead. That's where the report restrictions for. So same thing, activity monitor. Do you want to restrict or allow access? I should probably, for administrator, I should probably allow. Do I export to Excel? Allow it. Then on the LS reports, and you remember the LS dashboard, if I jump over here and just show we'll have, here's the entire dashboard. So every one of these options now is a checkbox, and which one will you allow people into. Now, so this is our full complement of products. Not everybody owns all of our products. So you may not own transaction auditing, so things are going to be grayed out if you're not licensed for the product. So this is a fully licensed version of our application. And if you don't, if you haven't bought all the applications, you may see some options show up on the screen, but they're grayed out, or they just don't do anything, or it comes up and says you're not licensed. So that would be a reason that you might not see something, or a checkbox might not work. On this demo, we're clearly fully licensed for everything. So on the LS reports, then, every time you see a drop-down arrow, I have more options underneath that. So if someone can get access to our security reports, and you remember that in the security reports, then this is a level of security you can set. And then, as we talked about yesterday, I have all these columns. That's actually controllable here now. Back to, if I do the drop-down in security reports, I can control which one of those columns somebody might have access to. So if you want to keep people out of the listener data or out of the statistical data, for their then on that menu, that will go away. They won't have options to those to see that information. And we get the same thing under the landmark reports. So on landmark security, do they have option to get into either the reports or the comparisons? And if they can get to reports, which level of reports can they get into? So that's how we control the security for the applications for the user, right? And every user can obviously be set up. I have 3 or 4 users set up here. Once they're set, they're saved, so I don't have to change anything here. I'll turn these back on, so we have. And that's really all you have to do to set up a user, right? You can edit the passwords here, and you can delete a user here, right? So you can change the password here if you want to. So that's setting up a user. So let's go back to scheduled tasks. Now, some of these, probably, I don't know, you'll have a half dozen or so on your system will have checkboxes already checked down here. We don't on our system have everything enabled. And those are scheduled tasks that are already set up and scheduled on the time frame to run that Mike or one of our techs would have set up initially when they installed the application. So you can change the names. These have long names to them. They have short names to them. Actually, if you have a non-descriptive name, let me show you an example here. Let me go to something like this is all the auditing. Let me come down here. Here's the snapshot. Here's LDAP. All right. So this LS LDAP data collection prod is how we're going out and collecting the data for our LS reporting. If I edit this, you actually can change this description to something that might be more intuitive for you, maybe make more sense. This is the description that probably many of you have. It's a long description like this, and embedded in it, it says LS9 reporting, get LDAP security. You might see that. So this has been changed a little bit so we have a more legible description that people understand. But these are the tasks, and you can see the schedule, so you can always edit these if you want. This is well documented how to set these up. But this one's going to run, actually use day or month. If days is set, then it's going to run every day. And it runs basically at midnight, right, on the hour, any day of the week. So every day of the week. So this one is running every day at midnight to automatically collect my information. So you can change these schedules. What will happen generally when we install the application, we're going to ask you what your backup schedules are, and we want to work around that. So if you have services shut down or things getting backed up, we'll fire off after that. So if you can see here, I'm going to always have on some of these that are running automatically. Again, I'll go down to that's analyzer, that's auditing, or was it down here at the bottom? There's a lot of these, as you can see. So here's LDAP. So I can see how long these take to wake. So this is taking 5 minutes to run. Not a big deal. Some of them might take, some of them might take 20 to 25 minutes to run, but it's automatic. If you want to run it on demand, all you have to do is hit the execute. So if you make changes during the day and you want to recollect this data, either for the SOD reporting or for the security reporting, and you'll see the analyzer that we talked about yesterday has its own collection of data. So that was right up here. Here's the analyzer data. So you can collect this anytime on demand as you want to. And it doesn't take that long. This one takes 9 seconds to run, so it's not a big deal to do. We also talked about the snapshots yesterday. So you'll see down here where it says snapshot. So here's where you have your landmark snapshots and you have your LS snapshots. Again, you can run these. I'm not going to run them because they take 4.5 minutes to run. But that'll go out and collect the data, give it that timestamp, and that's what we talked about yesterday, how you can do historical reporting in comparison to historical. That's where these run. So you can set up the schedule here to run, every month or however often you want it to run, or I can just run it on demand when I want, and it'll save it with that timestamp. So there's a couple processes in here that you may want to run on demand. The big ones for you are going to be the snapshots, the LS, LDAP data, which you're probably going to collect potentially on demand. The auditing data also. So there's a lot of options here because there's test and prod, and there's like 3 different ways Lawson allows you to configure your auditing for LS. So we collect the data regardless of which method you choose, and we can run them on demand, but we've got the code behind to pick it up anyway, whichever way you store it in their database. So these processes generally would also be set up automatically, but if you make changes during the day to security and you want them to show up in audit, you're going to have to come in here. I think ours is set up with the HTTP calls. We would run it this way, and it would automatically go up. And this one you see takes just a couple seconds to run, goes out, reads their tables, pulls it into our database so we can report on it. But most of these we'll set up initially with you. That will be run automatically. But again, if you want to run anything on demand to get data so you can report on it right away, you'll have to come in here and run these manually. But if you expand any one of these, it'll tell you what these are for, right? So you can expand this. You get a definition of what this is for. You may at times, when let's for instance Lawson goes through, you put in a new application for Lawson. Well, we collect all the forms, all the function codes, all that metadata behind the scenes, and we store it in our tables. Well, if you do an update or do a version change or install a new application, we need to recollect that data so we can pick up what all those new forms are, what the form descriptions are. We need it only to help you on descriptive purposes. I mean, we'll know the form name and we'll know the function code, but if we want to know what that function code is intended to be, what the long name of it is, and we want to know what that form name is, we have to go out and recollect that data. But it's a one-time deal. It updates those tables. So, maybe every few months we might have you run a collect full name type stuff, either out of the Gen database to get that information. But that's what when you see these scheduled tasks, these are really the tools that go out and grab your data for your reporting. Transaction audit rules we'll cover next week when we go through it. Now, reporting groups. This is another security feature, basically, that allows you to save reports for transaction auditing, mainly, and security auditing into groups of users. So I can define a group like finance, or I have accounting, or I have HR. I can define the group, and then I can add users to that group. So, you can add a group, so I just add a new group here, and I have 4 of them out here, or I can delete them. And once I have a group, if I select a group, I can then pick, a user and tell it what group does that user belong to. So all I'm doing here is I've got my users set up. So when you set up a new user, you're going to want to come in here and add them to a group. So when I go to save reports, as you'll see when we go through Dave goes through the stuff with the SOD and transaction auditing and security auditing, you'll be able to save a report to that group. And if you're a person that's in a group, so if Bill is in GL accounting group, he can only save reports that will be included in that group. So anybody in that group can run that report, but if you don't have access to that group, you can't run any of those reports or even see any of those reports. So you have to belong to that group. An administrator would be able to save reports into what we call a shared group. So if there's something the administrator feels that everybody can see, they'll put it into the shared group. So when that user logs into that tool, they'll see the reports that belong to their group or any groups they're in, and they'll see all the shared reports. So we have a handful of customers that use this. A lot of customers just leave everything open. Basically, everything goes to shared, and everybody can see everything. But there's a chance you're going to have people in HR. They're going to be developing auditing reports that they only want the people in HR to see, and the people in finance and procurement should not be able to see those reports. So they'll put them in different groups, and then they will not have any access to those reports to be able to run reports and build any new queries for those reports. But that's what grouping does. I'm going to let Dave talk about SOD policies, and I'm going to go down to schedule reports. So as you're going to see a number of tabs across the top. So these are all the areas that we allow you to schedule a report within our applications. They all share the same schedules. They all share the same email groups. So once you set up a schedule, you can use it over and over again. And you'll see we can do it for segregation of duties. I don't know if I have any auditing. Here's some auditing schedules. We talked about that a little bit yesterday, how in the LS reporting, I could set up a schedule and then I could activate the schedule. So you'll see here, I actually have transaction auditing. I have 4 reports that are set up to run, and I see the scheduler on it. I can select this and actually see a little bit of detail about it, or I can change it. I can now change the schedule if I want to. And the action would be is I want to enable it. So this is not saying what the current status is, it's saying what action do you want to take. So if I wanted to enable this report, I'll select it, and it'll change the disable flag. But now under TA now, you'll see that transaction auditing, that report will have a blue clock beside it instead of a gray clock. So now I've enabled that schedule to run. I'm going to turn it back off because those end up going default to me and I get a bunch of emails. So you're going to see different tabs here. Here's the LS reporting that we talked about yesterday. Here will be all your LS auditing reports. So whenever you set these reports up, you have to enable them over here. And again, that's really a IT segregation of duties. We don't want a person that you enable to define reports and save reports. It's nice they can do those on their own. They can set up their own schedules. But we won't let reports just start getting fired out without somebody reviewing what's on those reports and actually going in here and enabling that schedule. So you see landmark reporting. Here you can edit groups and schedules, so I can see which schedules are out there. Like the finance group has, if I hit 8 here, I'm going to see the reports that are currently scheduled within that finance group. I can see how many end of week reports I have and which ones they are. So these reports are all running to end of week. I got a font problem there with my browser, but so I get a little bit of information, and I can change, this information. I can change what the end of group. Maybe I want to change this to a Sunday night instead of a Saturday night, and I can change that schedule then too. So I know how many reports are tied to a particular schedule, and I know how many reports are tied to a specific group. The snapshots that we talked about, this is where I can look at where I've done snapshots for either LS or landmark. So I don't have any landmark snapshots right now. I have one for LS. So as you take these, if there's one you want to take and you decide you don't want that, just come in here. You can delete that snapshot. But we'll give you a history here of what you've retained. And then this is the sent reports. I don't have any right now, but that was the parameter we had back on the administration guide on where you could purge your sent reports and how long you wanted to keep them around. So that's within here, within the schedule reports section, and all the different tabs I have here and how I enable them and how you can delete them, and you can see what's assigned to what group and what's assigned to what schedule. Right? We don't have to go into really any of this. I will talk about manage restrictions a little bit. So anybody that's got the listener and knows it by that name, it's also, we call it activity monitor because we do a little bit more. And one of them is these restrictions. So we built this originally because you had no capability within LAUA security to ever do this. In LS now, you can put on some forms, you can put some, I think you can put some date and time restrictions about when they can be used, but you have to put them for, every form you put it on. So if it's, if it's the benefits, you got to select all the benefit forms, and you got to put all those rules behind it, and then it's always on. You don't have an easy way to toggle it off unless you're an administrator. So we have another tool that we moved from LAUA over to Security 9 that you can use. And what this will allow you to do, let me just go to edit existing here. I can set up these, we call them restrictions. So I'm going to go into this, just one called weekly test. And what I can, is that the one, maybe I want to go into a different one here. Let me go to, let's go to bi-weekly test. Let's go here. Okay. So what I can do is I can set up, let's say we don't want people to get into our benefit plans while we're running our payroll cycle. It's one we hear on a regular basis. So they send out emails to make sure nobody goes in and changes any benefit plans, every Tuesday or every other Tuesday between, 7 and noon, right? 7 a.m. and noon, whatever it might be. So without having to do anything to security, because we have the activity monitor running, we actually can stop that transaction and pop up a warning message or just an information message say, activity is not allowed during this time frame. So I can set up a restriction, and if you ever wanted that disabled, you can just come in and uncheck this. I don't have to go into security and do anything. I can just uncheck this, and now that restriction is disabled. Or we have people that instead of going on the schedule, they manually just turn it on and off. They leave a wide open schedule, but they turn it off when they want to keep people out of certain things. They got to come in here, enable it, and save it, and it's now they can't use the forms that are specified. So you see here I have different types of, I can do it daily, weekly, bi-weekly. If you do it bi-weekly, you have to tell us what week you're starting on, because we don't know if you're starting on the first week of the month or the second week of the month. So we're going every other, so we kind of got to know a starting point. And then what day of the week you want to do it, right? So on a bi-weekly frequency. And then the time you want to do it. And you can have multiple time ranges. It could be 7 to 8, and it could be noon to 1. So we can put in multiple time ranges by just putting add another time. We can allow you to allow people into inquiries. So when people have run this, they came back and said, we don't have any change in information, but it's okay if they look at information. So have an option that allows inquiries. You can go in, so they can get into these forms that I'm restricting only for an inquiry basis. So, what production, what server, what product line. And then these are excluded users versus included users. So if you have a process flow or you have people in HR that you want to be able to use these forms that I'm going to specify in the next section, then I exclude users from this restriction. I don't want to include 4,000. I want to exclude 10. So we'll bring up all users, and you can allow to exclude the users. So the LS admin user is excluded from this restriction. Everybody else is going to be hit. And then we have the forms we want to deny. So we can pick system codes, and there's an easy way to select a range. I put in all the benefit forms, or BN17 at least. So I'm not allowing any changes to these benefit plans between the hours, I think I put like 7 and 8 a.m., whatever that might be, on every other week on Tuesdays. And the message I want to pop up, when they try to do a change, they do an inquiry, it's fine, but if they try to do a change, it's going to pop up this message, changes to benefit plans not allowed, on Tuesday mornings. So if this was a Tuesday and it's 7 a.m. and I went in and tried to do an inquiry on BN17.1, I'm just going to I do an inquiry, but if I want to do a change, it's going to actually capture that transaction and stop it and say they're not allowed during this time frame. Right? And it'll just say okay, and it'll go back to their screen and they can do an inquiry. But that's what this manage restrictions is for. And you have manage your want. There's a view calendar, so you can see when here's my bi-weekly test here. So I can see when those are going to run, and I can select this one and tells me kind of what it is. No end date, runs between 7 and 8. So I can see which ones I have running here. But that's what the manage restrictions for. I think that's really all I want to take you through on the administration side for the most part. We don't get into any of the configuration on the install. For the real tech people, we do have an installation manual that you probably have that tells you how we've configured it within WebSphere and on your application. That's not an administration function. That's more of this tool, right, of the dashboard. That's more of a behind-the-scenes thing. But we have a full documented manual that, if you run into problems, how to change that web.xml file, if you have TA or listener, how to uninstall the application if you're starting to see any kind of problems, how to reinstall it. if you have I think hopefully most of you know that if you're running activity monitor listener or transaction auditing, this is not the case for any of the reports, but if you install a Lawson patch or do an upgrade or change servers, certainly if you change servers, but even a Lawson patch, they have a web.xml within WebSphere that they don't try to merge with anything out there. They're assuming nobody's modified their file. So they overlay the file that we've gone in and modified. So if you do a patch, our product you have to go into WebSphere, and there's 2 lines, it's called a filter, that have to be put back into that file, which you can do within the WebSphere admin panel. And that's documented in our documentation. But a lot of people forget that they put a patch in. Then we get a call that says, we're not collecting data anymore on our monitor. What happened? First question we ask is, did anybody install a patch? And they find out that yes, a patch was installed, and all of a sudden that's why I don't have a week's worth of data. So if that's going to be done, it's a 15-minute process at the most, and your team can do it. You don't need us to do it, but we will. It doesn't take any more than 10 or 15 minutes to put in at the most. It probably takes Mike or Harold or Kevin probably 5 minutes to do it. But just keep that in mind, that if you're going to do a patch or going to do any kind of upgrade, in most cases, Lawson will write right over the top of the file we've modified and not try to do any kind of merge with it. Right? The other key thing that I want to make sure everybody understands, that it's in the documentation, is that you always, again, this goes back to transaction auditing or activity monitor. It doesn't apply to the other products. You want to make sure, if you restart Lawson, you need to make sure that our server is actually up first. Because what will happen is that the Lawson server, as soon as it reboots, our WebSphere application is going to try to reach into the Kinsey virtual server to grab parameters, all these parameters I just showed you. It's going to kind of grab those parameters and pull them back in, and we hold all those parameters in memory on the Lawson server. We don't keep a database on the Lawson side. So if the Lawson server is rebooted, we lose those settings. So when it's restarted, it has to go back to our server to find them. And our server is not up. So just make sure that our server is started before you restart the Lawson server. Now, once it grabs those parameters, you can, if our server goes down after that, or if you turn the VM down off intentionally after that, there's no impact. Lawson runs fine, because all we try to do, the only time Lawson tries to communicate to get data from our server is when you restart Lawson. But very important that you know.